Hi, I'm Michelle Morris. I am the lead pastor here at First United Methodist Church in Bentonville, reflecting on what it means to experience the foolish love of Christ. But before we go into that, I want to stop and think about a story of one of the most profound mistakes of history that resulted in the freedom of millions of people. We want to think back to the end of World War II when Europe was divided into different pieces and Germany itself was divided into East and West Germany. And over the course of time between the end of the war and the construction of the Berlin Wall, about 200,000 people escaped East Germany to go into West Germany and experience a different type of freedom there. In order to stop that flow of people, there was a call among the communist side to build a wall between the two sides of Berlin, and that was the construction of the Berlin Wall, which took place in the year 1961. That wall stood for many, many years, despite the fact that people tried to flee. In fact, 200 people were killed just trying to cross from the eastern side to the western side of Berlin. And that construction divided families, divided friends, divided a people, all in the name of different understandings of government. On the 4th of November, 1989, mass protests broke out in East Berlin. They were sick of this division of the people. In order to deal with those tensions 5 days later, on the 9th of November, East German leaders sought to calm down all of that tension by loosening the borders just a little bit, to make it a little bit easier for people to get visas. It was meant to be a minor change, but it accidentally made a major difference. The memo was released and sent to spokesman Günter Schabowski, who did not have time to read the memo in advance. And so he stood up, read directly from it, in which it said, private travel outside the country can now be applied for without prerequisites. The press that had gathered was stunned and clamored for more details. They asked, when does this take effect? Schabowski didn't know, so he said, I suppose it takes place immediately. In the meantime, Harold Jaeger, who was head of the border guards on the wall, watched as crowds began to gather and press upon the wall and expect to be released. He called his superiors and asked for orders. Was he supposed to try and stop everyone, or was he supposed to open the doors? The leaders did not give him an answer. Facing no word from his superiors and the pressing crowd around him, he gave the order to open the barrier. What was supposed to just be a small bureaucratic change that made it easier for people to go across the border, instead brought down the Berlin Wall. I remember that day. I was in 10th grade at the time, and I remember the world was shocked. No one expected this to happen. But I also remember that the world felt differently that day. It felt like there was hope. It felt like there was love abundant in the world. All because of a foolish mistake. Now let's think about another story, another profound mistake of history that also has liberated all of us. Think back to that Holy Week when at the beginning, so many had gathered in protest, in acclamation, and it created a space of tension that meant that the powers that be were to respond by plotting and then succeeding at the execution of one man that they thought was insignificant, one man that the crowd had actually turned on, one man that couldn't have made that much of a difference. It seemed like a nothing action. It didn't look to have any consequences, and yet 3 days later, on what we now celebrate as Easter, the whole world changed. It felt not just like hope, but hope abundant. It felt not just like freedom, but unfeathered freedom. It felt not just by love, but unstoppable love. That moment, that foolish action in history has motivated all kinds of other foolish acts of love. If we think about what Paul is teaching in the passage that we're studying for this day, think about the fact that Paul is proclaiming how ridiculous it is that a crucifixion leads to liberation. And yet that is what we proclaim, the foolishness of the cross and the foolishness of the empty grave. Yet that is not where it stopped. It motivated Paul not only to preach that, but to give his entire life in foolish acts of love, to found congregations, to continue to support them, to set aside his privilege and instead take up harassment, imprisonment, and ultimately death. And that same foolish act has prompted countless people to stand against empires, to build hospitals and schools, to live with the sick and imprisoned, to donate organs, to fight oppression, to stand up for the rights of others, to raise a family and teach their kids to love when the world tells us otherwise. And that foolish act calls us to love our enemy, to break down borders, to tear down walls, all the walls that divide us. That is the foolishness of the cross. Thank God for it. Amen.